when I look at the drawings my drawing students send me and compare them with the photo reference that they use, there are 8 things that I'm looking out for, particularly with street scene architectural drawings, that I'm looking for that show me how much concentration has gone into their observation. Observation of the reference, and then also observation of their drawing as they draw. Let me share them with you, and they'll give you a really handy 8-point checklist that's not just a great perspective checklist, but is a great indicator for you as to whether or not you need to work harder at observing what's in the reference before you let that pen go anywhere near the paper. So we'll get my drawing out of the way and we'll look at the first one. Now, we know from our perspective theory that even a complex building in a fundamental box design will have all of its perspective angles meet at the same 2 points on the same line on the eye level. And any photo of a building is going to show this. So when I look at a drawing and it looks like this, I can see that this line, and this line are not going to meet in the same spot. I can see that this line, and this line, as well as this line and this line, certainly aren't going to meet on the same spot. And there is no spot to line up on each side. And that tells me that when the person who drew this took a look at the reference, they saw approximately what was there. And then from memory, they drew that. And I know that because if they actually observed carefully what was really happening and worked hard to get the angles and the other things correct, the building would have looked more like this, where all the perspective angles going off on both sides of the building will in fact meet at the same point on the same line on each side of the building. I can tell whether the students have carefully observed by whether the windows that move on each side get narrower and narrower according to foreshortening. The apparent width of the window gets narrower and narrower as it moves further away, and the steeper the angle, the more exaggerated this transition becomes. And I don't need to look at their photo reference to know that this is what happens in the reference. And so to the degree that these windows all end up looking a bit the same width, that shows that observation hasn't been careful enough. In a drawing, it looks like this, where these windows are all pretty much the same width, as opposed to in life, where even if they are the same width in life, they appear to become narrower as they move further away. And for our third checklist point, we'll stay with windows, and I'm looking for windows that look somewhat like this, where there is a narrowing as the windows move away from us, but where the windows still end up being fairly squared off, because we know that's how windows look. And if we haven't looked carefully enough at our reference, then we haven't observed or reminded ourselves that in fact the tops of the windows and the bottom of the windows follow whatever perspective angles are needed for that side of the building going to the vanishing point. They don't look like this, in effect, which is really what has inspired this in the student's mind, the imagination that the windows are looking like this, drawing from memories of windows being rectangular rather than looking carefully at the reference. And there's one more detail that really shows careful observation, or the lack of it, while we're on windows. When I'm looking at a wall of a building and there are windows that are the same width, it's not simply that the windows top and bottom are at an angle rather than squared off, and it's not simply that they get thinner as they move further away, but from our given observation point, what we actually see inside the window changes the further away the windows go. So in the closest window, I'm actually going to see, in this case, this much of whatever the window is, whether it's a pane of glass, whether perhaps there's a strut down the middle supporting 2 panes of glass, whatever. But this window, because it's further away from me and because of the thickness of the wall, if there is a center strut, I'm not going to see that at all because it's hidden from this position in the thickness of the wall. And I'm just going to see a little bit of the far end of that pane of glass or whatever the support mechanisms are. For this third window, further away again, I'm actually not going to see any of the window at all. I'm simply going to see the width of the wall. And if there were more windows, then my next one, I would see just a portion of the width of the wall. Certainly the difference between the first 1 and 2 windows shows me whether the person drawing it has really observed the reference and seen the fact that what we see within each of the window spaces changes the further away it becomes. This next point is a great indicator again of observation, and that's where we have a streetscape where the ground moves upwards in this case or downwards, particularly in a relatively steep way. If we don't carefully observe the reference, it's easy to think that this ground level line is in effect one of our perspective angles in the same way this line might be. And what then happens is we have a great deal of problem at ground level working out how we arrange the angles, because we may have observed these upper angles carefully enough to see where they're at and do what looks like a reasonably consistent job, but then we don't know what to do down here because the pattern doesn't seem to work. And the pattern doesn't seem to work, the theory doesn't seem to apply in a satisfactory way at ground level because we haven't observed what actually happens in our reference on a steeply sloping street. We've looked at it, we've thought, oh yeah, I know this, I've got this. And what we draw shows that we both don't understand the principles of perspective with an uphill street, but more importantly, they show us that we haven't observed the reference carefully enough. Because if I observe the reference carefully enough and reproduce that in my drawing, I actually don't need to understand the perspective principles on uphill streets. Now, of course, I have a video on this. I have a video on all of these points. If you look at my perspective video playlist, you'll find them. But all of these issues can be avoided if we observe our reference carefully. And when I ask the students, why have you drawn it like this when it looks like that? They say, well, I don't know. It seems really hard to believe now. But at the time, I thought I was drawing it because they thought they had observed it carefully enough. The problem is not that they lack drawing skills to reproduce what's here in their drawing. The problem far more often is that they haven't actually seen carefully enough what they need to see to draw it well. They haven't appreciated fully that what we observe in order to draw is different from what we observe in everyday life for other needs and purposes. Let's look at our next indicator. And this is what I think of as perspective on the ground. And so many drawings have some element of the ground. And over again, I see the ground drawn in this sort of way, where if there's some sort of path or roadway, divisions that move backwards, they end up looking like this. We won't even worry about the grass and the trees. When in fact, if we were to observe the reference carefully, we would see that what we see looks far more like this. That these divisions, while they do get smaller, narrower as they move further away, as they should, it's not nearly fast enough. And this happens in our drawings because we know in theory this is what happens, but we haven't actually observed the reference enough to appreciate that in this reference, this is what happens. And in fact, in life, this is what happens. The separations the same distance away very rapidly get so close that they become just a continuous value that lightens as they move further away. Again, a small amount of understanding of perspective combined with looking quickly and thinking we've seen enough in our reference has given us a confidence that we know what we're doing that's simply not founded. And again, I don't need to really understand any of the perspective theory if I observe carefully enough and simply draw what I see. Now, this point is one of scale, and it's particularly a problem when there are people, when there are figures in our scene. And one of the reasons I know when I look at so many drawings that observation hasn't been careful enough is that when we align figures with our drawing, so these figures sit here, they don't really work with the scale of the windows and the doors. But equally, these figures, to find out how they work, again, we take the line horizontally, and now they're ludicrously small. And also, clearly now we can see that this figure and this figure, both adults, don't relate to each other, and they're really just on each side of the door. If they're the same height, then their relative size should be this one only slightly smaller than this one. And we have the same problem if we look at this one. This figure lines up really with the corner. And so again, we see that what we have here, the scale is not realistic. But if we carefully observed our photos, if we'd looked in the photos to see where the head lined up and where the feet lined up with the other reference points, and do what I do and put a dot in each of those spots, just to help work out where they're going to go and get the scale correct as I then draw between that space. But if we base this based on our reference first, then we can be confident that our figures will be in the proper scale for whatever other things we've drawn, but also in relation to each other. We have the same problem here. And if when we added these figures, again, we'd carefully looked at our reference, we would have seen that in fact, they couldn't be like this in relation to the architecture of this lower section. And that should have alerted us to the fact that we had serious problems with how we've seen and drawn this section. And it would have made it very clear to us that in fact this ground level line is not a perspective angle that's part of the other angles that we see. So when I see figures where their scale doesn't fit in with what's happening, I know that the observation necessary to align them properly has not taken place, and there's been a sense of, oh yeah, okay, I know what that is, and I'll draw a figure here, without adequately referencing by careful observation what we see. For this final one, I've traced a student's drawing, and I show here the reference photo that goes with it. Now the first thing I do is I line these up on my desk and I tape them down so they're not going to move. And now I want to check the perspective angles. The easiest way to do that is to get a strip of cardboard and to hold it in place on the angle that we want to check, and then to simply slide it across. And down here. And here. And this line. That one's pretty good. And it doesn't matter whether my reference photo is larger or smaller than my drawing. The angles stay the same. And they don't have to be perspective angles either. If I were in the beginner stage of learning to draw, and particularly if architecture was a part of what I was drawing, I would check in this way after every single drawing. This is the surest way to tell me if my observation skills with the angles are adequate or not. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Inadequate observation continues to be, in my experience with drawers, the single largest weakness, the most fundamental flaw of their drawing that sets them up to fall flat on their face the second the pen hits the paper, because there is not an adequate understanding of exactly what I've seen, how it looks in this place, in this scene, from this angle, in this lighting. And so when I go to draw, when the ink hits the paper, because I don't have enough detail clearly enough in mind, I'm basically drawing from my imagination, I'm drawing from my memory, or I'm simply guessing. And quite frankly, so many of the drawings I see show that. And I'm saying it bluntly because the hardest thing seems to be to convince people that their observation is inadequate. If you think this doesn't apply to you, but you know there's something not quite right with your drawings, why not apply this 8-point checklist to some of your drawings and just see if they indicate whether the underlying issue is not holding the pen or drawing straight lines, but it's having seen what we need to see in the first place to have a chance to draw it with some accuracy. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I really hope this helps. We can move on from one drawing to the next too quickly. This is the sort of thing we do when we critique our drawings that I often talk about, because it sets us up to understand what we need to pay more careful attention to next time. But working out whether the problem is lack of understanding perspective, whether it's just simply drawing too fast, trying to draw too much at once, or whether it's more fundamentally, I haven't learnt the skills of observing in order to draw rather than observing for other reasons in life. Because if that's what I need to understand, then this is a great way to discover that. But let me say, once we understand this, it actually fast tracks us for improvement. But look, whatever you need to do or not do, and however you feel about it, and whatever you're drawing, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.